Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today, and it's something that we tried to set up for a few years and couldn't, and thanks Sibylla also for your help. I think my job today is to kick things off with a very broad discussion of what may be the main dilemma in the world today, the conflict between ecology and economy. That is the conflict between planetary survival on the one hand and the survival of our economic system on the other. And if it turns out that this economic system can't survive in anything like its present form, well, what is Plan B? I think I have 45 minutes. I think that's what you told me, right? So, for this big subject. But then Doug and Gordon will pick it up from there, and Doug will talk about local systems and how to adapt, how to create an alternative local economy. And Gordon will speak about his experiences in business to adapt to this situation today that we'll be describing. I hope you don't mind, I'm going to be reading this, because when I have to do something complicated, I want to make sure I get the words right. So I'll try to be entertaining while I do it, if I can. I'm going to start with Copenhagen and the UN climate meetings that just concluded in December, where the world political leaders came face to face with a giant conundrum. We all saw their tortured dances as governments tried to avoid the grim choices before them. Take the example of my President Obama. Now, let me say, I like Obama. I think he exhibits a very serious awareness of climate change, the global mega problem, which clearly expresses the absolute limits of nature up against the economic passion for constant expansionism. I'm listening for the translator because she told me I have to go slow enough for her to keep up. The president got caught in a terrible dilemma. He tried to argue persuasively for lower emissions limits, but at the same time, he was desperate to revive a weak industrial economy that's showing sluggish growth or no growth. So while Obama talked climate change and sustainability, he's also pushing hard for accelerated industrial growth and consumption, particularly in such climate-deadly industries as automobile production and consumption, new road construction, expanded coal extraction, new oil drilling, new nuclear power plants, new housing starts, and numerous other attempts to expand heavy industrial sectors. Watching from a distance, we really don't know if he personally understands the contradictions in this pattern, how one effort cancels the other, or if he's simply seeking a safer political choice. If so, it's safer only in the very short run, as the entire industrial capitalist model may be facing unsolvable problems in the very near future. But for the moment, the main point is this. In a choice between addressing the stresses of the planet and addressing the stresses of corporations, the president chose the latter. Could he have done otherwise? Of course, Obama was not alone in this choice. Nearly all governments of the world exhibited similar conflict. Even those with a true desire to reduce carbon emissions felt their first priority was to help stimulate economic growth for their own industries. After all, without growth, businesses die, and so do national economies and jobs. And yet, as we'll discuss during the day, continuous systemic growth is impossible on a finite planet, nearing the end of its resource base. A lot of people blame China for the failure of Copenhagen. And I don't know, maybe failure is what the Chinese wanted. But in my view, no individual country or small group of countries was to blame for the failures of Copenhagen. The real deal killer was the central commitment of nearly all countries, but especially the wealthy industrial countries, to stimulate corporate growth at all costs, everywhere, while at the same time claiming to seek emissions cuts. That contradiction was the impossible burden of Copenhagen and the real dead end, and there's little sign it will change. Nowhere among the assembled nations, with the exceptions of Bolivia and Ecuador, was there expressed any significant national recognition of the limits of nature, planetary carrying capacity, or emphases on conservation, that is, to seek economic models that favor less production, less consumption of energy and materials, less shipping things across oceans, and the reshaping of economic systems to live within the realities of an environmentally suffering planet. Deliberate conscious moves toward extensive conservation would have required economic transformations that few corporate powers, bankers, or heads of state can possibly accept. And they would certainly defy the bases of free enterprise capitalism. Clearly, proposing economic contraction as a solution is not likely to be popular. So we're left with the profound dilemma: how to solve one problem, climate change, or on the other hand, how to solve economic growth without exacerbating the other. And yet, if you don't save the planet, you don't save the economy either. That's what's so exquisite about this moment. Or to put it another way, there are no profits on a dead planet. Of course, many people say you can have expansive growth and ecological health. The answer lies with new, efficient technology, and I agree that some may prove very useful, especially in the energy areas. But as we'll talk about later, they can never be sufficient to solve the mega problem we face: how to sustain a bloated industrial system and a bloated way of life while it is killing its host. 5 months after Copenhagen, in April 2010, President Evo Morales of Bolivia convened a post-Copenhagen meeting in Cochabamba, Bolivia. How many of you know about that? Do you know about that? Was that reported here? No? It was barely reported anywhere. That meeting brought together some 30,000 of the protesters whose viewpoints had been largely ignored in Copenhagen. Morales found support from a few other countries, including Ecuador, which had been arguing in favor of such concepts as the inherent rights of nature, and had lately added that concept to its national constitution. Meanwhile, Morales, who was the only head of state from an indigenous background in the world, made his own positions clear, first in Copenhagen and then again at the event in Bolivia. The countries of the world have failed in their obligations, he said. We have a stark choice between capitalism and survival. Either capitalism lives or Mother Earth lives. Morales proposed 3 ideas. 1, that nature should be granted rights that protect ecosystems from annihilation. A universal declaration of Mother Earth rights with enforcement powers. 2, poor countries should receive compensation for a crisis that they are facing, but they had little part in creating. That concept is called climate debt. And 3, there should be a continuing world referendum on climate change, open to all people. Details would be worked out later during future gatherings, he said. He went on to denounce the systemic dependency on economic growth and overconsumption everywhere, and advocated a return to the wisdom of indigenous peoples, many of whom have continued to live in a sustainable manner for millennia. He reminded us that more than 50% of surviving global biodiversity is now on indigenous lands. And he particularly praised their concept of living well rather than living better by overusing the resources of their lands. So what do you think? Was Morales right about all this? Later, I look forward to your comments and discussions on that point. Unfortunately, as he admitted, Morales himself is not free from the conundrums, the same conundrums that face other nations. Bolivia, one of the poorest nations on earth and one of the most historically exploited, continues to allow large-scale, terribly environmentally devastating mining of lithium and natural gas for export purposes. Bolivia needs the export cash, Morales says, though he bemoans that need. But alas, the conundrum is universal. Okay, whether you're a fan of Morales or not, he's asking good questions. And certain things about this moment could not be more clear. Right now is the moment of the greatest challenge in history to the global economic project we have celebrated and lived by, taken for granted for nearly 3 centuries. A system we have treated as if it were nearly a law of nature, like gravity, permanent, as if it were given to us by God. It's an economic system that had its great day, it's an economic system that had its great days. It was able to grow and thrive during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, benefiting some people a great deal and some countries, while launching an explosive industrial expansion and creating the illusion it would go on forever. The glory days of this system came during the time when the natural world, the ultimate source of all wealth, all industry, all commodities, and all survival, was alive and well, expansive, freely offering its abundancies. Economist Herman Daly described those days, which extended through the mid-20th century, as a full world of resources. Economic adventurers of those early days enjoyed easy access to a planetary cornucopia of raw materials. They were aided by the largesse of great kings and by military and colonial incursions for economic exploitation, which helped provide cheap, abundant, and sometimes free labor, all leading to 3 centuries of nonstop global resource flow. Later in the 18th century, we add the huge technological advances, mass industrial production, railways, new energy infrastructures, all of it made practical and possible by one abundant resource, cheap fossil fuel. That fueled 2 centuries of amazing economic expansion and material wealth creation. But it was a wealth creation essentially rooted in the privatization of nature's offerings, removing the natural commons and transforming them and relocating them into our cars, homes, factories, and then our waste dumps, landfills, air, and water. That transformative cycle was the fundamental basis of our economy all those years, and still is. Rapidly growing populations helped a lot too. They expanded global markets and helped keep factory wages low. Then in the mid-20th century came a new magical ingredient, the birth of mass electronic media, television, and then its celebrated marriage to mass market advertising. It was a magnificent spiritual alignment. Television and advertising joined to blast their imagery into the brains of billions of people day after day for a full half-century, showing how life was supposed to be and how you were supposed to be. all of it sponsored by a relatively few global corporations. During the second half of the 20th century, advertising grew exponentially by nearly 200 times. People were routinely watching 6 hours per day in the United States. The average person saw 30,000 commercials per year, and ownership of global mass media became increasingly concentrated. By the year 2000, 70% of all global media was owned by 10 corporations, thus enabling the domination of a very singular worldview. And nowhere in that mediated worldview was there the slightest suggestion of the limits of nature or that this process might not go on forever. Mid-20th century, that's a key moment. I remember those days very well. I was 20 years old, taking my graduate degree in international economics from Columbia University Business School in New York. My personal advisor and professor was none other than Dr. John Fairweather, who some consider the guru of globalization. The infamous Bretton Woods meetings had recently concluded. The world's leading industrial governments, corporations, and economists came together to invent a new global economy that would rebuild countries ravaged by war, prevent future war, and eliminate global poverty. They considered themselves do-gooders, idealists. The IMF and the World Bank were born. Export-oriented economies became the byword. Free trade, open markets, privatization, deregulation, those were the concepts, the pathways. They cleared the way for global corporations to operate without any restriction, the ultimate in high-speed, laissez-faire capitalism. Local and indigenous sustainable economies became officially a bad thing, while the giant global corporation was celebrated as the universal champion of peace and freedom and free market hyper-growth. Dr. Fairweather and thousands of others in academia and government and media painted glorious visions of how globalization would be the panacea to solve all problems. As corporations got richer, everyone on earth would be better off. Wealth would trickle down to all, they said, and the rising tide would lift all boats. Never included in this utopian picture was that the source of all this growth and the prosperity it was supposed to bring all began with nature and was dependent upon it. The idea of limits to nature or limits to growth remained unthinkable, heretical, at least until the 1960s. And the ideas of Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, David Brower, you may not know, who was the head of the Sierra Club in the United States and a very fierce activist, and the limits to growth movement from the Club of Rome started pushing back. But they were quickly dismissed. Please, no party poopers, not while everyone is still drunk on growth and profit. That was more than 60 years ago. How has the whole model worked out? Well, it hasn't stopped wars, that's for sure. It started them, particularly over resources, oil wars, mineral wars, and coming soon, water wars. But anyway, wars have been profitable for many industries, and meanwhile, wealth has not trickled down. According to the United Nations, we now have the greatest disparity between rich and poor within countries and among countries than ever in history. Rather than the rising tide lifting all boats, it seems to have mainly lifted yachts, while also undermining the true basis of future economic stability, while destroying the so-called natural capital of the planet. I'm going slower than I expected because I'm letting the translator keep up with me. I hope I can get this done. Even now, the system remains oblivious to its connection with nature. And even now, there's very little recognition that the global ecological and social context has drastically changed over 300 years. Or most importantly, that our economy and everything else we do is utterly embedded in and dependent on the ever-giving nature of a planet with extreme limits. But the end of the road is clearly in sight. It has been a great party, but the party is over. Now the central questions become these. Can our economic model survive this change of circumstances? Can industrialism survive at anything like its present scale without cheap energy? Can globalization survive in a world of scarce resources and expensive transport? Can tourism survive? Can global capitalism be reformed, adjusted, or made relevant to the moment? I'm happy to say that my own organization, the International Forum on Globalization, got the message 5 years ago. We started organizing about it then, and 3 years ago, we planned a giant public teach-in in Washington, D.C. We called it the Triple Crisis. It included these 3 elements. 1, climate change, of course, clearly advancing rapidly everywhere on the planet. 2, peak oil and the imminent global shortage of inexpensive, safe energy from any source. Peak oil means the decline of global oil supplies, which has already begun, and the quality has also begun to decline. And the third crisis, perhaps most important, the global resource depletion crisis. It's not only cheap energy that is disappearing, but also a long list of other crucial, scarce resources, such as fresh water, already a gigantic problem in parts of Spain, arable soils, grain production, forests, biological and genetic diversity, life in the oceans, coral reefs and wild fish stocks, key industrial minerals and metals, including coltan. You can say goodbye to your cell phones in a few years. To phosphorus, copper, platinum, silver, zinc, cobalt, as well, of course, as clean air and a normal climate, among others. And now we should probably add a fourth element, making it a quadruple crisis: the rapidly expanding social, cultural, and geopolitical chaos, resource wars, mass migrations, hunger, as well as new regional independence and sovereignty movements trying to take matters into their own hands. All these conditions combine to suggest a dramatic alteration of how we will do business and live on the earth, as well as the scale, ingredients, dynamics, and assumptions of our economic operating systems. Industrialism on a large scale, long-distance transport, many forms of tourism, Mallorca beware, globalization, industrial export agriculture, complex urban and suburban systems, and many commodities basic to our present life: automobiles, plastics, chemicals, pesticides, refrigeration. All are rooted in the basic assumption of ever-increasing supplies of inexpensive, cheap energy. Okay, what are the root causes of the situation? They're not really mysterious. They're really obvious. I've already mentioned several. But let me now explicitly list the 6 points that I think are primary. The first problem is an economic system that's utterly dependent upon exponential economic growth to achieve its profits, and the race to dig up the earth for ever more natural resources wherever they are to feed that growth. This despite the fact that the very concept of never-ending systemic growth on a small, finite planet is really preposterous and arguably a little bit mad. The first, I lost my place. Here I go. Second, a profound systemic disrespect and ignorance of the limits of the natural world, that human activity is merely a subset of nature, and that profound planetary limits exist in terms of resource availability, material throughputs, and waste absorption. Third, closely related, the fierce promotion of the ideologies of consumerism, fueled by billions of dollars in advertising. I used to be in that business, It's a system dedicated to the belief that personal commodity acquisition is the primary and only means to individual happiness and fulfillment. That's certainly the case in the United States. Fourth, most obviously, a half-century of reckless use of fossil fuels. Fifth, overpopulation, which makes all of the other conditions worse and has grown far beyond the capacity of the Earth to sustain. And sixth, the global corporation itself, the primary global actor in all of this, which operates on a hierarchy of values that puts the need for economic growth and profit above all others, proselytizes on the benefits of laissez-faire governance. Capital must be unimpeded to do as it must, and insist on an amoral hierarchy of values, including the celebrated values of self-interest. Of course, the most central element is continuous growth. Growth is the lifeblood of the global system. How to build it, expand it, sustain it, protect it. System-wide economic growth is what rules global trade, and it dominates the thinking of large corporations, especially if their stocks are offered publicly in stock markets. Local businesses are not included in this critique. If they operate locally, local control, and so on, it's a complete different set of conditions. Growth rates ultimately determine profits. The stock values of the corporation, the rate of corporate investment, the ability to get loans, the dividends paid out, the ability to expand production into new markets, and the salaries and bonuses of the CEOs are all dependent upon growth. Without hypergrowth, the system crashes. Alas, however, for an economy dependent upon never-ending growth to be successful, in turn requires fulfillment nonstop, and here comes another list of 3 more absolutely impossible conditions. 1, never-ending supplies of accessible cheap resources. 2, never-ending supplies of new markets. 3, never-ending supplies of cheap labor. Resources, markets, and labor. Those are absolute requirements for the system. None of these is sustainable in the long run. Okay, what about cheap labor? It's yet another ridiculous assumption that cheap labor supplies go on forever. Do workers really want to be cheap? I don't think so. Whether they're in the US or Spain or Thailand, workers are aggressively sold the idea that rapid economic growth and globalization will make them rich, or at least better off. That was one of the big selling points for globalization. Rapid growth would end poverty. As wealth trickled down, it would trickle down to all. Workers saw that on television and generally believed it. We all believed it. 50 years later, it is clear that it's not true. Very little trickles down, the wealth mostly trickles up. Most benefits of globalization stay at the top of the pyramid. In fact, it's desperately important for growth of the globalization project that workers should remain poor and as inexpensive as possible. This enabled corporations to move to countries with the cheapest labor costs and helps ratchet down salaries everywhere. All rules of international bureaucracies like the World Trade Organization are designed to help this process. Okay, the third impossible condition is the need for ever-expanding markets. That's also impossible. First of all, many primary markets are now already nearly saturated. This is true in parts of the industrial world, certainly in the United States. Even with the race to buy all the latest, newest, best computers and iPads and so on, consumption cannot keep growing forever. And neither can the population keep growing forever. There's a limit to how much stuff people can buy, how many cars can be built and bought, how many refrigerators and electronics we can fit into our house. Some days I think people must surely wake up wondering if all this stuff makes them happier. It happens there's a lot of research on this point about happiness. Have any of you seen that research? No? It turns out, and there's been lots of books on this point and research projects, it turns out that as individual consumption levels increase, in other words, as people get richer and richer, they don't get happier. Once people get to a level where their basic needs are taken care of, where they have a place to live, they have clothes for their children, they have schools, they have food, they have health care for their family, if that level is reached, people are satisfied and can call themselves happy. As they get a little bit richer beyond that level of basic satisfaction, we can call it satisfaction plus 10. They do get a little happier, more room for occasional luxury, more room for error. But from that point, if they continue to get richer and richer, the rate of happiness increase declines. And as they get very rich, happiness itself actually declines on a very alarming scale. Meanwhile, so if the word gets out about that, it's going to be a problem for the capitalist system, I think. Meanwhile, a lot of industrialists still have their hearts set on marketing their goods to China, since that was supposed to be the mega market of the future. With 1 billion consumers hungering to each have their own car and freezer and iPod and to fly back and forth to vacations in Mallorca or Hawaii and everywhere else. That will never happen. China and India are not exempt from environmental limits, which are already beginning to deal with big time. Pollution, unbreathable air, not to mention flooding expected to arrive from melting Himalayan glaciers. Climate change is just as relevant to them as everyone else, even if they didn't cause it. Like the US, China is now running around the world trying to buy up as much of Africa and other places as possible to save their resource supplies. It will only work for a short time only. So expanding resources, cheap labor, unlimited new markets. The future doesn't look good. The modern economic system is actually very fragile. If economic growth curves decline even a tiny amount, like from 1.5% to 0.5%, as they recently have, oh my God, what a tragedy this brings. What a mess. The entire system starts to fall apart. The financial classes go into panic, new investment slows down, old investments are sold off, consumption slows down, jobs are lost, people go broke, home mortgages cannot be paid, mortgage banks and investment banks start to fail, and even our dear free market system, they have to be bailed out, stimulating the downward spiral. All this negative reaction is generated by the most minor drop in the growth curve. Imagine what happens when the curve goes negative for 3 months or 6 months or a year, as it recently did. The whole apparatus is a house of cards. It's so fragile that it's capable of collapsing from the next foul wind. Without constant growth, it can't keep functioning. And yet this is the system we all depend upon for our survival. Clearly, it's a system that can only thrive when conditions are ideal, such as they were back in the 1900s, when the planet was still abundant with natural resources, cheap labor, and new market opportunities. But none of these are possible anymore. Where do we go from here? Okay, let me see how I'm doing on what people are saying about solutions. And I know Doug and Gordon will take it much further, but I want to say a few words about it. First, about false solutions, because there are a lot of those dominating the conversation right now. The most talked about solutions still come from industries most involved in the problem and their great moves to design a green economy. Monsanto Corporation is now running a $1 billion advertising campaign saying they're all about sustainable agriculture and saving small farmers' livelihoods, feeding a hungry world through biotechnology. Chevron and Shell oil companies are both running billion-dollar campaigns about how they are solving the global energy problem. They're all about clean energy. Soon I expect to see similar ads from BP. Bank of America and Citibank are now running ads saying how hard at work they are financing all kinds of small businesses in your community for an economic recovery. They're famously not doing that. Back in the 1960s, when I was in the advertising business, we used to have a term to describe this. It was called eco-pornography. In fact, it's a pretty good rule of thumb that most advertising tends to sell the features that the product actually does not have. Have you seen the airline ads about how comfortable flying is now, how much legroom you have, and good food? For most of industry and most governments, the main desire is to try to turn these crises into business opportunities. Just as in Copenhagen, they're arguing that we can sustain economic growth and production at present bloated levels, despite resource shortages, bank failures, and the end of cheap energy. They have to say that. To say anything else will turn away shareholders. But so far, when most bureaucracies or corporations speak of alternatives, they invariably turn towards grand technological fixes or market incentives. No one ever speaks about the necessity of outright conservation or powering down, the idea of not growing or of using less total energy, or of serious energy descent programs, of less material throughput, less overall consumption. Industrial capitalist powers cannot advocate this, as it would undermine their own economic viability. But that is what we need to talk about. And Obama is certainly an example of not talking about it. By far the most popular solution in the United States now is to go shopping and buy green, something called green consumerism. Billions are being spent in advertising to tell people that the way to save the planet is to shop. I'm not kidding about this. There's one website, very popular, called Climate Cooler, that has the slogan, "The more you shop, the cooler it gets." Here's the idea. You buy new jeans online, or dozens of other products, and some of your money goes to plant trees to offset the greenhouse gases. It's like carbon trading through shopping. So I guess everything is going to be okay for the polar bears, after all. In the energy area, the big push to replace oil and gas now is for clean coal. This is in the United States, via carbon sequestration. That means capturing the carbon that's released from the production and essentially burying it, perhaps alongside nuclear waste from clean nuclear energy systems, which are also coming online, so-called, which are also being revived to keep them all from leaking into the soils and rivers. Of course, the idea of clean coal is absurd. Carbon sequestration is a fantasy, at least 30 years from any meaningful development, if ever. It's in the same category as nuclear fusion, or for that matter, human teleportation. It is not going to happen. And even if it did, an important point about coal, that it's not only the emissions from coal that are a problem, there's also the mining. Much of the coal mined in the US is from what's called mountaintop removal, where they take the tops of the mountains in Appalachia, turn Appalachia into a desert and poison all the rivers, and that's where the most new coal comes from. Biofuels. I think by now we can all see that biofuels, especially corn ethanol, are a disastrous technological choice. They replace a tremendous amount of food-growing land to instead grow fuel. I'm sorry, I really did not to me sounding totally negative. Really, I am emphatically not against innovation and efficiency where they can be helpful to the overall problem we see. Some technological progress is clearly useful. There's great potential, for example, for certain kinds of solar, wind, wave, small-scale hydro, and even certain small-scale biofuels. Together, they could bring far less environmental and social destruction than oil, natural gas, which is what Mallorca lives on, coal, or nuclear. They're also not as subject to geopolitical trauma, including wars, as oil, gas, and nuclear. But I am against the grand delusion that they'll solve our problem. there are crucial limits that need to be recognized. We recently did a great new report. It's called Searching for a Miracle. I have a few copies here you can look through later if you wish. Which concluded, it's an examination of 18 different alternative technologies. And it concluded that no combination, no collection or combination of these new alternative energy systems, including wind, solar, and small-scale hydro, which are otherwise beneficial, that would begin to match the performance of fossil fuels sufficiently to maintain the industrial growth society at its present level. The book compares these 18 energy systems in terms of net energy. Net energy compares the amount of energy that goes into the production of an energy system, as well as the amount of resources that go in, as compared with the amount of energy that comes out. Energy in versus energy out. Corn ethanol and other biofuels, for example, actually have negative net energy. More energy goes into producing biofuels than actually comes out. Solar and wind do have positive net energy measurements, about 10 or 15 to 1, about equal to nuclear, which has other terrible, unsolvable problems. But oil, when it was in abundant supply, had a net energy of over 100 to 1. That was truly liquid gold, cheap oil. But now that oil is in shorter supply, more difficult and expensive to recover, and of lower quality, and causing horrific oil spills, its net energy ratio is heading down toward wind and solar to make those more practical. But wind and solar, even combined with each other, and even combined with all the other decent alternative systems, does not offer nearly the potential volume to begin to approach oil. Scale matters. Alternative fuels will not save the day, nor should they be thought of that way. They're not a panacea that can save the present wasteful industrial economy, which has already grown far beyond the capacity of the planet to sustain. Renewables should only be conceived as partly replacing a highly destructive carbon and nuclear system, and must be used in combination with increased efficiency, conservation, lower consumption levels, and lower material throughputs. Now, there's one other false solution that I want to quickly mention that definitely needs addressing, and I'll be quick about it. I have to say something about geoengineering. Who's heard of geoengineering? Okay, well, it's beginning to happen. These are mammoth projects now proposed to essentially redesign the planet. I never thought such ideas would be taken seriously, but in the US they are, and it's largely because of the huge contracts that may get generated. Let me wave another report at you here. This is not produced by us, by the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, in collaboration with the Etc. group from Canada. It's called Retooling the Planet. Here are some of the terrific, and it's a critique of geoengineering. Here are some of the terrific ideas that the report says are currently being seriously investigated. Blasting billions of sulfate particles into the stratosphere to reflect the sun's rays and to make a cooler planet. Fertilizing the ocean with iron or nitrogen particles to nurture CO2-absorbing plankton. Genetically engineering all crops around the world so that they will all have bio-leaves that can better reflect sunlight. Covering entire deserts with huge reflective sheets to keep sunlight off the earth. Covering the Arctic snowpack and glaciers with a nanofilm to reflect sunlight and prevent melting. Putting vast arrays of superfine reflective mesh of aluminum threads up in space between the Earth and Sun. Creating synthetic trees engineered to have additional carbon-sucking properties. Re-engineering the flow of rivers on the planet in order to provoke new cloud formations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. There are hundreds of them. The Swedish report quotes from a US Presidential Advisory Committee in 1965. Way back then, predicted the problem of climate change. That was the good news. Rather than suggesting we eliminate fossil fuel use, they recommended that we do these things. That there might be unintended consequences to these approaches. Of course, climate change is already history's greatest unintended consequence. doesn't seem to worry anyone. Technology will solve that problem too. To even begin to take ideas like that seriously is really a sign of our desperation and alienation and the degree to which we're stuck in a mental box. Okay, to finish up, where do we go from here? Our great colleague and friend Teddy Goldsmith, I'm sure some of you knew him before he died last year, had been addressing this point directly. He used to say, quote, "From this moment forward, we have to do exactly the opposite of what we've been doing in every possible way." So what if we were actually in charge? At this early stage, what could we say about the ingredients of a new future economics that could live within the Earth's limits? One important positive fact is there's no shortage of people who are dedicated to figuring it out. They are already working to seize the moment. I saw this kind of moment once before when there were suddenly 80,000 people showing up in Seattle in 1999. And in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where 100,000 people gathered to oppose globalization and seek local empowerment. And in Brazil, in Porto Alegre that was. And another 250,000 who demanded land reform and so on. And we just saw this great protest in Bolivia. These people are not necessarily protesting capitalism or neoliberal theory or growth economics. They know the system is broken, and they're not waiting for anyone else to fix it, and are very, very hard at work to try to redesign the system. We also see the trend in the tremendous movements in the United States for organic local food production and toward empowered local economies. I'm sure this has begun, and I know this has already begun in Mallorca. Community-supported agriculture systems and disconnection from the global trading system. We see it in the great work of organizations like the Post-Carbon Institute in the United States, and especially the Transition Towns movement in England. I don't know how many of you know about them. Anybody else know about the Transition Towns? They're getting very, very, very popular. They're helping communities redesign their energy systems, their food systems, their local transportation systems, obtaining local control, and achieving local self-sufficiency. This is a thing that Mallorca ought to pay attention to, because Mallorca has great potential to achieve local self-sufficiency once you decide that tourism may not be the sustainable answer for Mallorca. There's great fertility in the soil here. There's great agricultural possibilities and an agricultural history. Okay, to summarize, what does our side want? We can save the planet by adopting a few main principles. Less, local, equitable, sufficient. Let's quickly summarize a few of the key items. Formal recognition that all economic activity is embedded in nature and that there are strict limits of the Earth's carrying capacity. These represent absolute boundaries that humans cannot exceed without endangering human and planetary survival. All economic planning has to start there. Recognition that macroeconomic growth as the basis for systemic economic activity is in direct conflict with planetary and even regional realities and should be abandoned. Far better is to work toward what's called steady-state economic systems that recognize limits. Some things can grow, but overall the system has to stay steady. Only enough material energy production to reach that level, only enough material throughput to sustain that level. Abandonment of the idea of wealth and commodity accumulation as the basis of success and happiness. The establishment of new standards of economic sufficiency. And the abandonment as obsolete any economic system that cannot conform to these realities. Instead of globalization, we encourage localization. Instead of growth economics, we want to work towards steady-state economics. Instead of gross domestic product measurements, we favor standards of maximum production. Instead of hyper-consumerism as a prime value, we favor standards of sufficiency, where needs are met and excess is banished. Instead of more global trade, more global travel, we want less global trade and less global travel. Instead of expanding energy use, even clean energy, we seek less energy use, powering down. Instead of wealth accumulation as the goal of society, we want equity and orderly sharing of global resources. Instead of a global food supply, we want to emphasize local foods and local people. We would like to see reintroduction of the once popular import substitution model for national activity, once popular in the 1930s. Okay, how do we get there? With difficulty and over time. There are no bona fide experts on this, but there are hundreds of books and thousands of people working on it. Doug is going to give you one great example of it. One place we could start is by checking out some of the websites and publications of the organizations I have named. I encourage you to go to the Post-Carbon Institute and especially the Transition Towns movement in England. I'm out of time. I think I've gone a few minutes over, but I'll be around all day, and I guess I'm supposed to answer questions. I will close by repeating a phrase I heard last evening at a Hindu community biodiversity conference in London. Quote, "The pain of making big changes is a lot less than the pain of not making big changes." So thank you so much for your attention during this long speech.